Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. In the wizarding world, the name Percy Weasley more often sparks irritation than admiration. He's strict, ambitious, sometimes even unbearably pompous, and for that he's harshly criticized. But have you ever wondered why Percy ended up in the role of the misunderstood one? Maybe there's more behind his actions than meets the eye. Let's figure out why this Weasley brother deserves more understanding than ridicule. Enjoy watching. Number 1, we only saw him through Harry's biased perspective. Throughout almost the entire story, we perceive Percy only through Harry's lens, which means through his sympathies and prejudices. Ron and the twins constantly mocked their older brother, and Harry naturally accepted their view. As a result, readers formed the impression that Percy was a bore and a careerist. It was only in the end, when Percy returned and fought shoulder to shoulder with his family, that Harry finally looked at him without bias and realized here was a brave man capable of admitting mistakes. Number 2, his ambitions were never encouraged. Yes, Percy was overly serious and not always pleasant to talk to, but that doesn't take away from his achievements. A prefect, excellent grades, a job under Barty Crouch, all of these were real accomplishments in the wizarding world. Yet instead of support, he faced nothing but mockery. The twins teased him, Harry laughed along with them, and his family seemed to ignore his career drive altogether. Percy's ambitions weren't just unsupported, they were turned into a reason for ridicule. Number 3, Molly Weasley didn't favour him, she defended him. At first glance, it may seem Percy was his mother's favourite. Molly did often take his side, but not because of special affection, rather because the other children constantly poked fun at him. She tried to shield her eldest son by praising his accomplishments, because otherwise the balance against all the jokes would have been impossible. And it's important to understand, Percy never used this protection for selfish reasons. He was simply the one who, in his family, was mocked more often than praised. Number 4, he cared about his family, but was avoided. Few saw Percy as a caring brother, but that's exactly what he was. He looked out for Ron and Harry when they were in danger, tried to cheer Ginny up, and during the Triwizard Tournament he even rushed toward the lake, ready to save Ron. And yet his efforts were almost always rejected. His relatives saw his actions as nagging or needless fussiness, when in reality they were signs of genuine worry and care. Number 5. No one explained the Order's motives to him. And perhaps this is the most important point. When the war began and the Weasley family joined the Order of the Phoenix, Percy was left on the outside. No one bothered to explain the Order's motives to him in detail, to tell him the truth about the dark past and sacrifices. To him it looked like this. The ministry, where he had just begun his career, was suddenly branded as evil, and his family demanded he give it all up and fight the system. Is it any wonder he met this with distrust? He was forced to choose, but without being given all the information. Under those conditions, Percy's reaction was predictable, even if it was painful for his family. Number 6, he was loyal to rules, not to evil. Percy's loyalty was never to Voldemort or cruelty. It was to rules, to the idea that structure kept the world safe. When Cornelius Fudge insisted that Harry was lying about the Dark Lord's return, Percy stood with the ministry. To him, the Minister of Magic represented order, while whispers of rebellion sounded like recklessness. "The boy's making it all up," Fudge declared in Order of the Phoenix, and Percy repeated the line because he believed in authority, not because he wished harm on Harry. This distinction matters. Many wizards chose denial out of cowardice, but Percy chose it out of faith in the system that had raised him. To Percy, the ministry was not a tool of evil, but the backbone of society. In his mind, siding with his family meant siding with chaos, and chaos had already scarred the wizarding world. He was wrong, but not malicious. His mistake was not betrayal of love, but blind trust in law. Number 7, he was mocked for traits that were praised in others. Hermione Granger was praised for her ambition, Her endless hours in the library, her obsession with rules, even her habit of correcting teachers, were seen as admirable. "I hope you're pleased with yourselves. We could all have been killed. Or worse, expelled," she snapped in Philosopher's Stone, and readers smiled at her passion. Yet when Percy acted the same way, his drive was branded arrogance. His love of rules and order became the butt of jokes, not the mark of discipline. The double standard was sharpest when it came to academics. Hermione's perfect grades were celebrated, but Percy's achievements as prefect and head boy were reduced to mockery. Fred and George mimicked his serious tone, calling him pompous whenever he reminded them of the rules. Even Ron dismissed him, telling Harry that Percy was the world's biggest git for caring so much about school and work. What was seen as brilliance in Hermione became laughable in Percy. This contrast revealed not Percy's flaws, but the bias of those around him. He and Hermione shared the same hunger for recognition, the same belief in structure and effort. But Hermione had Harry and Ron to soften her image, to remind others of her heart. Percy stood alone, without defenders, and so his virtues were twisted into vices. His ambition was never less noble than Hermione's, it was simply less loved. Number 8, his successes were not taken seriously. Percy rose higher and faster in the ministry than most wizards his age. Working under Bartemius Crouch in Goblet of Fire was not a small feat. Crouch trusted him with important tasks, and Percy carried them out with precision. "Weatherby, take these down," Crouch would command, and Percy obeyed without complaint. For a young wizard just out of Hogwarts, this was proof of talent and discipline. Yet his family never saw the honor. They mocked him for taking his job too seriously, turning his progress into a running joke. When Percy became junior assistant to the minister, the response was the same. Cornelius Fudge relied on him during official functions, and Percy relished the responsibility. For most families, this would have been a moment of pride, but the Weasleys laughed. Fred and George rolled their eyes at his stiff robes. Ron dismissed his work as sucking up. Even Harry, influenced by Ron's scorn, saw Percy as pompous. His long hours and sacrifices were invisible because no one wanted to see the effort behind them. In truth, Percy's ambition was his way of proving that he was more than the boring brother. He had no dragons like Charlie, no Quidditch glory like Bill, no fame like Ron, no charm like the twins. What he had was discipline, and through it he climbed. The tragedy was that his achievements were dismissed as vanity when they should have been respected as hard-won victories. For Percy, every parchment filed and every rule upheld was not pride. It was survival in a family and a world that rarely noticed him. Number 9, he was denied the right to make mistakes. Percy's greatest crime was not cruelty or betrayal. It was a mistake. When he sided with the ministry during Voldemort's return, he believed he was choosing stability. He trusted Cornelius Fudge, the system he had worked so hard to enter, but one wrong decision was enough for his family to brand him a traitor. Ron spat his anger, Fred and George mocked him, and even Arthur turned away. Percy had no room to stumble. The label of disloyal son clung to him like a curse. Others were not treated the same. Ron abandoned Harry and Hermione in Goblet of Fire, and again in Deathly Hallows. Both times he was forgiven without hesitation. Sirius nearly killed Snape as a student, but he remained a beloved figure. Even Dumbledore admitted to grave mistakes, and still he was revered. Percy, however, was given no second chance. His single misstep defined him, erasing every act of loyalty that came before. The silence between him and his family grew heavy. In Order of the Phoenix, Percy returned a letter to Ron, coldly warning him not to follow Harry. The words cut deep, but behind them was a boy desperate to defend the only world that seemed to value him. No one looked past the ink on the page to see the fear underneath. They saw only treason. Percy had no path back because the family he loved refused to let him try. When he finally returned in Deathly Hallows, it took a war to make forgiveness possible. Only in the face of death did his brothers welcome him again. By then, the damage was done. Years of exile had carved a hollow place in Percy's life that no victory could fill. He was punished more harshly than most, not for being worse than them, but for being less loved. His mistake was never truly about betrayal. It was about being denied the grace of forgiveness that others received so freely. Number 10, he still proved his bravery. When Percy returned to his family during the Battle of Hogwarts, it was not the act of a coward seeking shelter. It was the act of a man who had chosen courage over pride. For years his brothers had mocked him, his parents had been disappointed, and Harry had seen him only as an obstacle. Yet Percy still walked back into the fire, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who had turned their backs on him. "Let's finish this together," he shouted to Fred in Deathly Hallows, a cry that marked his redemption. That night he fought not as the prefect, not as the ministry worker, not as the outsider. He fought as a Gryffindor. Percy threw himself into the battle with the same reckless bravery that his brothers had been praised for all their lives. He cast curses, shielded his family, and risked his life against Death Eaters. For once, no one could deny his courage. Yet because the story is told through Harry's eyes, Percy's bravery faded into the background, overshadowed by the chaos of the final battle. The most heartbreaking moment came when Fred fell. Percy collapsed beside him, his composure shattered. The boy who had once hidden behind rules and regulations was suddenly just a grieving brother, clutching Fred's body and screaming in despair. It was the rawest proof that Percy had always loved his family. Rules had been his armor, but love was his true core. That moment showed his humanity more than any achievement at the ministry ever could. Still, readers rarely remember Percy as a hero of that night. They remember him as the rigid prefect, the rule follower, the Weatherby of Bartemius Crouch. But history within the books tells another truth. Percy Weasley came back, he fought, he bled, he suffered. In the end, he was no less brave than Harry, Ron, or even Fred. He simply carried his courage in silence, and silence does not always make it into legend. Number 11, he always lived in the shadow of his brothers. Percy Weasley's greatest burden was being invisible. In a family of 7 children, every brother seemed to shine brighter. Bill was the daring curse-breaker in Egypt, admired even by teachers. Charlie was the dragon tamer, full of charm and bravery. Fred and George lit up every room with mischief, earning admiration even when they broke the rules. And Ron, despite his insecurities, stood at Harry Potter's side, the boy who lived, making him unforgettable. In such a lineup, Percy's quiet achievements seemed pale, no matter how hard he worked. At Hogwarts, Percy tried to make his mark. He became prefect, then head boy, titles that should have brought pride to the family. Yet when Molly proudly announced Percy's head boy in Prisoner of Azkaban, the room only filled with Fred and George's jokes. "Big surprise," they muttered, mocking his achievement. What should have been a moment of triumph turned into laughter. Percy had chosen discipline and study as his path to recognition, but even those victories were swallowed by the noise of his siblings' adventures. The contrast was cruel. When Ron played his first Quidditch match, the entire school seemed to cheer. When Fred and George released fireworks or invented skiving snack boxes, students adored them. But Percy's successes were drowned in silence, or worse, ridicule. It was not that his accomplishments were small, they simply lacked the sparkle of dragons, broomsticks, or explosions. His life was footnotes in a story dominated by brighter personalities. So Percy clung to the one place where he could stand alone, the Ministry of Magic. There at least he was not Ron's brother, or Fred and George's joke. He was Percy Weasley, a man with ambition and purpose. Readers often judge him harshly for this choice, but can we blame him? Living in the shadows of louder, bolder brothers, Percy only wanted the chance to prove that his light mattered too. Number 12. His strictness was mistaken for coldness. Percy Weasley was never cruel, though many painted him that way. His insistence on rules and order was often mistaken for coldness. At Hogwarts, he demanded that younger students respect curfew, behave in the common room, and take their studies seriously. To Fred and George, this made him an easy target. "Shut up, Weatherby," they teased in Goblet of Fire, reducing his authority to a joke. Yet Percy's discipline was never about ego. It was about making sure that those around him were safe in a world where danger was quietly spreading. Take the Triwizard Tournament as an example. When Harry's name emerged from the Goblet of Fire, Percy immediately insisted on protocol. He sided with the rules, even when others wanted to dismiss them. To his family, this looked like arrogance, but underneath was fear. Percy understood that ignoring rules could open doors to chaos, and chaos in the magical world often led to tragedy. His sharp words and rigid stance were shields, not weapons. Even at home, Percy's strictness was misunderstood. When Ginny was recovering after her ordeal with Tom Riddle's diary, Percy hovered around her with concern, masked as scolding. Molly Weasley saw his intentions, but the rest of the family dismissed him as overbearing. They laughed at his fussiness, never realizing that Percy's so-called coldness came from a place of love. He wanted his sister to heal, and order was the only language he knew to express care. In truth, Percy's stern exterior was the armor of a young man who didn't know how to show tenderness. He lacked Fred's humor or Ron's easy loyalty. His way of loving was through structure, advice, and caution. Readers, bound to Harry's perspective, rarely noticed this side, but if one looks closer, Percy's coldness reveals itself as an anxious kind of warmth, the love of someone who feared losing his family more than anything else. Number 13, he was an inconvenient hero. Of all the Weasley siblings, Percy Ignatius Weasley became the most misunderstood. His story is not filled with daring adventures like Harry's, nor does it sparkle with humor like Fred and George's endless mischief. Instead, Percy's narrative feels heavy with duty, rules, and the unrelenting pressure of ambition. When one looks closely, his tragedy lies in being overshadowed by the legend of Harry Potter himself. Percy was never the kind of hero that captured attention. He was meticulous, orderly, and deeply committed to authority. In a world that celebrated rebellion, rule-breaking, and charm, Percy was doomed to be labeled as rigid, self-serving, and even cowardly. But was this entirely fair? Or did Harry's shining presence push Percy into an image of being the unpleasant Weasley, when in fact he was simply a different kind of hero? Percy's character is introduced in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone as the responsible prefect. He patrols the corridors, enforces rules, and lectures his younger siblings on proper behavior. Percy the prefect, as Fred and George mockingly called him, was not meant to inspire laughter, but to embody discipline. Yet already this seriousness put him at odds with the tone of Harry's world. From the very beginning, readers are encouraged to admire mischief, independence, and defiance. Harry sneaks through corridors at night under his invisibility cloak, Ron plays wizard chess recklessly, and Hermione, despite her own love of rules, breaks them to help her friends. Percy, however, was portrayed as the foil, the rule keeper who opposed that spirit of rebellion. He wasn't fun, he wasn't adventurous, he wasn't the kind of character readers were trained to adore. This narrative lens began to cement Percy's role as the difficult Weasley. The tragedy deepens when Percy tries to achieve recognition not through chaos but through order. In Chamber of Secrets, while the younger students struggle with the mystery of the heir of Slytherin, Percy worries about his position as a prefect and his secret romance with Penelope Clearwater. Readers laughed at his secrecy, mocked his pompous attitude, and dismissed his accomplishments. But in truth, Percy was carving out his own path. Unlike Harry, whose fame was handed to him by fate, Percy was working tirelessly for every ounce of acknowledgement. Yet because the story centered on Harry's heroic defiance, Percy's obedience appeared weak, his ambition appeared selfish, and his efforts seemed laughable. The narrative world had no space for a quiet bureaucratic hero. By Prisoner of Azkaban, the gap widened. Percy received his head boy badge, and instead of being celebrated as the first Weasley to achieve such a distinction in years, he became the butt of jokes again. Fred and George ridiculed his endless talk of responsibility, while Harry and Ron dismissed him as insufferable. The books themselves reinforced this perception, reducing Percy to comic relief. Percy would never get a girlfriend if he didn't stop acting like he'd swallowed a broomstick, Fred once joked. But this ridicule overshadows something significant. Percy was the brother who understood structure, politics, and the path to influence. In another kind of story, he might have been the steady hand guiding younger rebels toward lasting change. Instead, with Harry in the spotlight, Percy was framed as arrogant rather than disciplined, ambitious rather than visionary. The conflict reached its peak during the war. In Goblet of Fire and Order of the Phoenix, Percy's loyalty to the Ministry set him against his family. Readers judged him harshly for siding with Cornelius Fudge rather than with Harry. Percy has chosen his side, his father declared bitterly. To the fandom, this became proof of Percy's betrayal, proof that he was self-serving and blind. Yet, when one pauses to consider, was his choice truly so irrational? At the time, the Ministry was the established power, the legal authority, and Harry was a boy whose claims about Voldemort's return were unverified. Percy, ever the bureaucrat, placed his trust in institutions rather than in whispered rebellion. That was not cowardice, it was consistency with who he had always been. In any realistic society, people like Percy are necessary, the ones who uphold systems, while others plunge into chaos. But against the myth of Harry's courage, Percy became the traitor. This is where Harry's presence becomes particularly decisive. Because Harry defined the moral compass of the narrative, those who doubted him were written as villains or fools. Fudge became corrupt, Umbridge became sadistic, and Percy became pompous and disloyal. The narrative punished all who did not align themselves with Harry's vision of truth. Percy, therefore, was not given the freedom to be complex. His belief in institutions could have been portrayed as tragic loyalty, his struggle for recognition as a noble but flawed pursuit. Instead, the story made him a symbol of the wrong side, and the fandom followed suit, branding him as insufferable, cowardly, and selfish. Harry's very existence narrowed the spectrum of acceptable heroism, pushing Percy outside its borders. The irony is that Percy's values were not entirely alien to Harry himself. In Philosopher's Stone, Hermione initially echoes Percy's worldview. We could have all been killed, destined, or worse, expelled. Yet Hermione grows into a beloved hero because she learns to balance rules with rebellion. Percy, however, never gets the chance to evolve in the same way. His seriousness is permanent, and his reconciliation with the family in Deathly Hallows feels abrupt rather than transformative. When Percy returns during the Battle of Hogwarts and fights alongside his family, it is not celebrated as redemption, but treated almost as an afterthought. He was never allowed the arc of a tragic hero who earns recognition. Instead, Harry's myth dominated to the end, leaving Percy as a footnote in a family of bright stars. Number 14. His mistakes were exaggerated. Of all the Weasley children, Percy was the one most often turned into a caricature rather than a character. Readers are encouraged to remember him as pompous, rigid, and blindly devoted to the Ministry. Yet when we look closer, it becomes clear that Percy Weasley was treated with a disproportionate harshness, especially when compared to the mistakes of other beloved characters. The shadow of Harry Potter himself loomed so strongly over the Weasley family dynamic that Percy's misstep, siding with the Ministry at the peak of its denial of Voldemort's return, became a stain that seemed unforgivable. But why? Was his sin truly so great Or was it the narrative weight of Harry's journey that forced Percy into the role of the outcast? Percy's worst moment came during the summer of 1995 after Voldemort had returned, and the Ministry refused to admit it. He quarrelled bitterly with his parents, and with Arthur in particular. He accepted a promotion at the Ministry and cut ties with the family. Molly, devastated, tried to reach him through letters, but he sent back a cruel response, urging Ron to distance himself from Harry. It is easy to see this act as betrayal. However, step back and look at the context. Percy was a 20-year-old young man, freshly graduated, ambitious, and eager to succeed in a system that had raised him to value order. To Percy, Dumbledore and Harry seemed like destabilizing figures, Cornelius Fudge. Offered certainty, security, and career progress. For a boy who had never been as effortlessly adored as Fred, George, or even Ron, the chance to be valued at the Ministry must have felt irresistible. Compare Percy's actions to those of Ron Weasley during Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Under the pressure of Horcrux-induced despair, Ron abandoned Harry and Hermione in the middle of their mission. "I'm sick of it, all right," he shouted before disapparating. His departure left Harry and Hermione in despair, facing the impossible task without him. And yet, when Ron returned, his mistake was swiftly forgiven. Harry and Hermione allowed him back into their circle without punishment, their affection overriding their anger. Ron's act, though understandable in context, was arguably more damaging than Percy's. He left his friends vulnerable in the midst of war, but Ron's redemption was always expected, while Percy's estrangement was depicted as near unforgivable until the final moments of the battle. Sirius Black provides another example of double standards. In his youth, Sirius betrayed his own family's trust by nearly getting Severus Snape killed at the Shrieking Shack. If you'd gone down there, you'd have met him without a wand. Do you know what could have happened to you if Lupin had seen you? James Potter scolded him afterward. The act was reckless and cruel, a near unforgivable prank that could have ended in death or lifelong trauma for Snape. Yet this moment was brushed aside. By the time we meet Sirius in Prisoner of Azkaban, he is cast as the tragic hero. The misunderstood godfather, his youthful cruelty becomes a footnote. Readers and characters alike extend forgiveness because Sirius's later suffering, Azkaban, wrongful imprisonment, and his loyalty to Harry redeems him. Percy, by contrast, never receives such grace. His betrayal is remembered longer than Sirius's attempted murder of a classmate. Even Dumbledore, revered as the wise leader of the Order of the Phoenix, carried secrets so devastating that they could have shattered trust forever. He concealed the existence of the prophecy from Harry for years, admitted only when pressed. "I cared about you too much. I cared more for your happiness than your knowing the truth." He orchestrated the plan that would eventually lead Harry to walk willingly to his death. He concealed his dark, youthful obsession with Gellert Grindelwald and the circumstances of his sister Ariana's tragic death. These were monumental deceptions with lasting consequences, and yet Dumbledore remained beloved, his mistakes softened by his wisdom and his sacrifice. Percy, whose sole great fault was political blindness and ambition, bore the stigma of betrayal with no such leniency. The hypocrisy becomes clearer when we consider how quickly Harry himself extended forgiveness to others. In Order of the Phoenix, Harry forgave Ron's jealousy in their 4th year and Hermione's secrecy when she withheld information about the firebolt. In Half-Blood Prince, he forgave Ginny for years of being distant and awkward, embracing her wholeheartedly when romance blossomed. Harry even extended understanding to Snape despite a lifetime of cruelty, once he learned of his sacrifice and hidden love. "Look at me," were Snape's final words, and Harry honored him afterward. The same Harry, however, never went out of his way to defend Percy or suggest reconciliation during the years of his estrangement. His silence allowed Percy's stain to deepen. The harsh judgment against Percy seems tied to the way his actions reflected on Harry. By siding with the Ministry, Percy was not only rejecting his family, but also rejecting Harry's credibility. For a boy whose every claim about Voldemort was being dismissed as hysteria, Percy's dismissal hurt more than others. "He's making a fool of himself," Percy wrote to Ron about Harry. That sentence, cruel as it was, made Percy an enemy in the eyes of Harry's supporters. To Harry, Percy symbolized the world's refusal to believe him. And because Harry's perspective dominates the narrative, readers inherit this resentment. Ron, Sirius, and Dumbledore could all err because their loyalty ultimately bent back toward Harry. Percy's loyalty bent away, and that alone sealed his fate. Yet consider what Percy truly did during his estrangement. He worked at the Ministry doing his job. He accepted promotions. He believed wrongly that the Ministry represented the greater good. He never joined the Death Eaters, never plotted harm, never endangered lives intentionally. He made one catastrophic error of allegiance, and for this he became the cautionary tale of the Weasley family. Meanwhile, Fred and George repeatedly engaged in reckless behavior that endangered themselves and others, setting off fireworks in school and experimenting with untested products on unsuspecting classmates. Their antics were seen as charming, mischievous, and forgivable. Percy's discipline and ambition were seen as arrogance, his loyalty to authority as betrayal. Number 15, he proved that admitting guilt is strength. Percy Weasley was often dismissed as pompous, ambitious, and detached from his family. But when his story is examined closely, it becomes clear that Harry Potter's presence in the larger narrative contributed to the way Percy was unfairly remembered. The focus on Harry's victories and bravery overshadowed subtler acts of courage, such as Percy's ability to admit he was wrong and seek reconciliation. In the world of magic, where great duels and epic sacrifices captured everyone's attention, the quiet bravery of acknowledging guilt was rarely celebrated. Yet Percy's choice to return to his family during the Battle of Hogwarts was as profound as any spell cast that night, for it required not only courage, but humility, something that many of the so-called heroes never demonstrated. When Percy broke with his family, it was not because he hated them, but because he believed he was following the path of reason. The Ministry of Magic, corrupt as it was, seemed to him the only source of order. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Rowling writes that Percy sent a cold letter to Ron, warning him to distance himself from Harry. The letter carried the tone of someone desperately clinging to authority. "I sincerely hope that you will avoid Harry Potter at all costs. He is nothing more than a liability to those around him." For readers, this letter cemented Percy's image as arrogant and traitorous. Yet this was not betrayal in its truest form, it was fear disguised as loyalty to the wrong institution. Percy lacked Harry's instinct for rebellion, but possessed something else, the willingness to admit later that he had been wrong. The truth is that Harry himself often refused to apologize for his misjudgments. His temper in the 5th year, his constant clashes with Severus Snape, his refusal to consider that Dumbledore might keep secrets for good reason, all of these moments showed a boy unwilling to bend. Even Hermione, the voice of reason, rarely confessed error. She justified her choices as necessary, even when they were not. Ron, impulsive as he was, would leave Harry in anger and return later, but not with the kind of open admission Percy eventually offered. Percy's act of contrition stands apart because he did not hide behind excuses. His apology was unadorned, a raw acknowledgement that he had chosen wrongly, and that takes a kind of bravery the battlefield cannot demand. The scene in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows where Percy bursts back into the Weasley family's side is a moment of redemption too often overlooked. He appears during the chaos of the final battle, dishevelled and desperate, and declares, "I was a fool, I was an idiot, I was a pompous prat, I was—" only to be cut off by Fred's laughter. That confession was not merely comic relief, it was the climax of Percy's entire arc. Few characters in the series stand before their family and admit complete fault. Percy was not forced by death nor cornered by exposure. He chose to stand there and dismantle his pride. If readers dismiss this as too little too late, they ignore how rare such humility is in Rowling's world. Percy's courage here becomes even clearer when compared with Cornelius Fudge. As Minister of Magic, Fudge consistently denied Voldemort's return, refusing to admit his misjudgment until it was too late. He clung to power, fearing humiliation more than the Dark Lord himself. The result was catastrophe, countless deaths, broken trust, and a shattered ministry. In contrast, Percy risked humiliation and the wrath of his family to admit guilt before the war was even over. He embodied the antithesis of Fudge, and in doing so showed the kind of growth the ministry's highest leaders lacked. Even Dumbledore, as wise as he was, admitted his faults only when cornered by Harry in the Deathly Hallows. He confessed that his youthful ambition had driven him to dangerous friendships and dreams of domination. But Dumbledore's admission came in the safety of King's Cross, in a liminal space between life and death. Percy, on the other hand, made his confession in the heat of battle, with curses flying around him in front of the very people he had hurt. There is a raw humanity in his act that Dumbledore's lofty speeches cannot match. It was not wisdom that guided Percy, it was remorse, and remorse requires strength. The tragedy of Fred Weasley's death is forever tied to Percy's return. The irony is cruel. Just as Percy mended the bond with his family, he lost a brother. Rowling describes Percy's reaction with devastating clarity. He clutched Fred's body and screamed in anguish, refusing to let go. This moment highlights why Percy's return matters. Without that reconciliation, Fred would have died estranged from his brother. The apology, the laughter, the tears, all of it came just in time. And though grief consumed Percy, it also preserved his dignity. The world remembers Harry's duel with Voldemort, but the memory of Percy mourning his brother is just as important, for it reveals the cost of pride and the redemptive power of humility. Harry himself benefited from Percy's lesson, though indirectly. The final confrontation with Voldemort in the Great Hall required Harry to admit he had misunderstood Snape for years. He had to acknowledge that Snape's love for Lily defined the story in ways he had never grasped. Harry confessed this silently, in action rather than words, when he called Snape the bravest man I ever knew. But Percy's example had already been laid out, the courage to acknowledge fault, not simply to triumph in battle. Harry's victory was physical, but Percy's was moral. Both were essential, but one is remembered while the other fades into the margins. Number 16, he was a prisoner of others' expectations. Of all the Weasley children, Percy Ignatius Weasley carried perhaps the heaviest and most invisible burden, and it is easy to see how the presence of Harry Potter only deepened that weight. Percy was born into a family where every child carved out a place in their own unique way. Bill, the eldest, was adventurous and daring, setting the tone with his position as head boy. Charlie was brave, athletic, and beloved for his passion for dragons. Fred and George, mischievous twins, deflected all scrutiny through humor and brilliance in chaos. Ron, the youngest boy, could blend into Harry's shadow. And Ginny, the baby of the family, had the unspoken privilege of being cherished simply for being the last. But Percy, situated squarely in the middle, was expected to be the one who followed the rules, who lived up to the model of academic excellence, who carried the Weasley name without scandal or failure. He became the embodiment of what a son should be, and that role was never truly his choice. Harry's arrival at Hogwarts amplified this burden in ways that are rarely acknowledged. From the moment Harry joined the Weasleys at King's Cross in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Percy was placed in a situation he could not control. Harry was not only famous but also a symbol of greatness, luck, and destiny. When Harry became so close to Ron and later to the Weasley family as a whole, Percy's efforts to distinguish himself as the responsible one seemed to pale in comparison to Harry's natural heroism. Percy studied tirelessly, earned the title of prefect, and later became head boy, but these achievements seem trivial when compared to Harry flying on a broomstick at 11 years old, catching the golden snitch in his mouth, or confronting Voldemort by the end of his first year. In a family where Harry became almost an honorary child, Percy's cautious diligence was overshadowed by the sheer brightness of someone else's destiny. It is telling that when Percy was awarded his prefect badge in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, his pride was almost desperate. He strutted around with the badge, lectured his siblings, and reminded everyone of his new authority. This behavior is often remembered as pompous, even ridiculous, but it came from a deep place of insecurity. He had worked tirelessly for something that finally gave him recognition, yet his siblings mocked him, and Harry, without even trying, drew the admiration of professors and students alike. The irony was cruel. Harry broke rules constantly, yet his rule-breaking was celebrated as bravery. Percy, who obeyed every rule and clung to the system, was dismissed as boring or insufferable. The double standard reveals how unfairly Percy was judged. One of the sharpest examples of this comes in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, when Percy tries to stop Ron, Harry, and Hermione from sneaking around. He insists that they stay in their dormitory, reminding them that rules exist for their safety. On the surface, this is Percy being annoying, but in truth he was desperately trying to maintain control in a situation where the school was under threat. For Percy, rules were not just restrictions, they were lifelines. He clung to order because it was the only way he knew how to cope with chaos. Yet again, his attempt at responsibility was treated as foolishness, while Harry's dangerous actions were celebrated as necessary heroism. This contrast placed Percy in the impossible position of being a villain in his own home and school, merely for doing what was expected of him. Even within his own family, Percy became the lightning rod of frustration. Mrs. Weasley adored him, constantly praising his achievements, and this affection set him apart from his siblings, who resented his favoured status. Fred and George, in particular, saw Percy's seriousness as a joke. When they teased him, it was always with the edge of resentment. In Prisoner of Azkaban, they mockingly called him Weatherby after a mistake made by Mr. Crouch, knowing how much the joke stung. Percy endured this ridicule because he knew no other way to respond. If he defended himself, he looked arrogant, and if he laughed along, he betrayed the part of him that needed to be taken seriously. His family wanted him to be an example, yet when he tried, they laughed at him. Harry's presence deepened this contradiction further. Molly Weasley doted on Harry, knitting him sweaters and treating him like another son. This was a kindness, but for Percy, it meant competing for approval against someone whose heroism was effortless. Percy worked day and night, but Harry earned affection simply by being himself. Imagine the quiet bitterness of watching your mother gush over someone else's triumphs, while your own are met with rolled eyes and mocking laughter. When Percy was promoted at the ministry, he was proud, but Harry's casual bravery at the Triwizard Tournament eclipsed that completely. For Percy, his career was not only ambition, but survival. If he could not shine in heroics, he would shine in order, hierarchy, and titles. The turning point in Percy's story comes during Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. By then, he had achieved what he thought he needed, a respected position at the ministry. Yet when he warned his family that aligning with Harry and Dumbledore would destroy them, he was treated as a traitor. The heartbreaking reality is that Percy was not betraying his family out of malice. He genuinely believed in the system he had devoted his life to. For him, the ministry represented stability, rules, and recognition, everything he had spent years clinging to. To side with Harry, who once again defied authority, would have been to betray the only path Percy had left. He chose loyalty to the rules over loyalty to a family. But that choice was forged in the crucible of years of being dismissed for doing exactly what was asked of him. It is impossible to forget the brutal scene when Molly Weasley rejected Percy's letters during Christmas in Order of the Phoenix. She wept over the estrangement, yet no one stopped to consider how Percy must have felt, isolated from everyone he had tried so hard to impress. He was called pompous, ambitious, and selfish, but his actions stemmed from desperation, not arrogance. Harry again stood at the center of the family conflict. His word was trusted, his cause followed, his bravery unquestioned. Percy's loyalty to the Ministry, meanwhile, was painted as blind foolishness. Percy's reconciliation in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows is powerful precisely because it exposes how much he had been misunderstood. When he returned to fight alongside his family at the Battle of Hogwarts, he admitted he had been wrong about the Ministry. But even in that moment of redemption, the tragedy of Percy's journey is clear. He had been condemned for years for choosing order, but no one acknowledged the crushing expectations that drove him to it. He was not a villain, but a young man suffocating under the pressure of being the perfect son, while watching Harry Potter, the rule-breaker, celebrated as the perfect hero. Percy's story is one of mirrors. Harry embodied chaos and triumph, while Percy embodied order and dismissal. The injustice lies in how the narrative judged them differently for embodying opposite values. Harry was rewarded for following his instincts, Percy was punished for following the rules, yet both were coping with survival in their own ways. Percy's tragedy was that his coping mechanism made him unlikable, while Harry's made him adored. Consider also how Percy's relationship with his siblings illustrates this injustice. Ron, though often overshadowed, was still the loyal friend of Harry Potter, and through that friendship he gained recognition. Fred and George, while dismissed at school, became celebrated entrepreneurs after opening Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Even Ginny emerged as a strong, independent witch and eventually Harry's partner. Percy alone was alienated because his form of success did not inspire affection. He was the bureaucrat, the climber, the symbol of an unpopular truth. That stability often comes at the cost of admiration. In hindsight, one can see Percy not as pompous but as tragic. He was a young man desperate for validation, trapped between a family that laughed at him and a world that celebrated Harry Potter for breaking every rule Percy had sworn to uphold. His obsession with the Ministry was not a betrayal but a survival mechanism. He needed structure to cope with the weight of being the ideal son, and Harry's effortless heroism only reminded him that he could never win affection by being himself. The injustice toward Percy was subtle, but it left scars deeper than those seen on the battlefield. He was mocked for clinging to rules, but no one asked why he needed them so badly. He was branded as cold, but no one wondered why warmth was so hard for him to offer. He was judged against Harry's light, and in that comparison he was always destined to fall short. Percy was not a villain in the Harry Potter saga. He was a casualty of expectations, a young man suffocating under the shadow of greatness that was never his to bear. The truth is that Percy Weasley was never given the chance to simply be Percy. He was forced to be the example, the one who justified his family's values, the son who carried ambition so the others could rebel. And when Harry Potter entered their world, Percy's fragile role collapsed under the weight of someone else's destiny. This was the injustice. Percy was never allowed to fail, never allowed to stumble, never allowed to be ordinary. He was forced to hold the line while everyone else, Harry most of all, was allowed to shine. Number 17, his honesty was out of fashion. Of all the Weasleys, Percy was the one who never quite fit into the story the way others did. Ron had the charm of the underdog, Fred and George were natural comedians, and Ginny blossomed into the brave young heroine. Even Bill and Charlie carried the aura of adventure and freedom, one a dragon tamer, the other cursed by dangerous goblin work. Percy, by contrast, was the embodiment of rules, order, and a relentless pursuit of ambition. And yet this pursuit was not rooted in cruelty or arrogance. It was the simple desire to live honestly by a code he believed in. He did not twist his words into clever jokes, nor hide behind evasions. He said what he meant, even if it sounded pompous. In a world that celebrated cunning, this sincerity became a flaw, and Harry Potter's rise to central importance in the wizarding world sharpened the edges of Percy's isolation. From the earliest days at Hogwarts, Percy was portrayed as overly strict, the kind of prefect who lived to scold younger students. But behind that stiff exterior was something often overlooked. He wanted to protect the institution he respected. When J.K. Rowling describes him in the Chamber of Secrets, patrolling corridors with his badge gleaming, it was not cruelty that drove him, but loyalty to the structure of Hogwarts. While Harry, Ron, and Hermione were sneaking out under the invisibility cloak, Percy believed that following rules kept people safe. "I don't want to sound dramatic," he said once, "but it's a matter of life and death." His words were mocked, but Percy was not wrong. A monster really was loose in the castle. The irony was that his honesty about danger made him look foolish compared to the more glamorous bravery of Harry. Harry's presence amplified this contrast. Where Harry bent the rules and was praised for it, Percy upheld them and was scorned. The scene in Goblet of Fire, when Harry is illegally entered into the Triwizard Tournament, illustrates this perfectly. Percy, working in the Ministry, defends the official processes, standing firmly by the rules that govern the competition. Everyone else is busy joking about how Harry somehow attracts trouble, but Percy voices what few dared to, that the situation was deeply suspicious and dangerous. He was branded pompous again. But his honesty was dismissed not because it was wrong, but because it was unfashionable. Honesty without humor, without the varnish of charisma, became a weakness in the shadow of Harry's celebrated defiance. The family dynamic also worked against Percy. Fred and George never missed a chance to mock him, calling him head boy in exaggerated tones, reducing his pride in achievement to a joke. Ron mirrored their tone, dismissing his older brother's seriousness as dull. Even Molly, though proud of her children, often sided with the laughter rather than acknowledging Percy's perspective. Percy's honesty often lacked charm. He could not, like Fred, turn seriousness into a laugh, or, like Harry, veil his own discomfort with self-deprecation. He said what he believed without sugarcoating. And his family often punished him for that. The moment he stood by the Ministry rather than Dumbledore during the escalating conflict, his honesty reached its peak. He truly believed the Ministry was the most legitimate authority, and he declared it. Instead of engaging with him, the Weasleys cast him aside, as though honesty was betrayal. It is easy to forget that Percy was young himself. At just 20, he left his family's home to live according to his convictions. Many admired Harry for taking stands at 11, 12, and 13, but Percy's act of defiance was treated as treachery. He was painted as a cold bureaucrat siding with corrupt men like Cornelius Fudge. Yet Percy was not scheming. He believed that the Ministry, for all its flaws, was the backbone of wizarding society. When Fudge insisted that Dumbledore was exaggerating Voldemort's return, Percy trusted him because his entire life had been built on the belief that institutions kept chaos at bay. His mistake was not dishonesty, but excessive honesty in following a system that failed. "You are blinded by the love of your office," Dumbledore might have said to him, but Percy was not blinded. He was loyal to an idea, and it cost him his family's affection. Harry himself, though rarely cruel, became the standard against which Percy was judged. Harry's defiance was romanticized, sneaking into the restricted section, flying to retrieve the Sorcerer's Stone, breaking countless school rules. These acts were excused because they were tied to destiny. Percy, meanwhile, was consistent in his insistence that rules mattered, and because of this he was labeled humorless. Yet when one steps back, is it not fair to ask why one child's rebellion is heroic while another's discipline is ridiculed? Harry benefited from narrative favor. His every breaking of rules led to revelation or triumph. Percy's following of rules led to scorn because honesty that lacked charm did not make for good storytelling in the eyes of his peers. Consider the Christmas dinner in order of the Phoenix. The Weasleys sit together, a fractured family, and Percy is absent. He has sent back his Christmas jumper, an act that cut Molly to the heart. Everyone saw this as cruel arrogance. But imagine Percy's perspective. He had been honest about his convictions, clear in his allegiance, and his family treated him as though he were no son of theirs. In that loneliness, perhaps sending back the jumper was not malice but despair. Harry, sitting at that table, received love and loyalty even when his temper flared and he shouted at his friends. Percy, whose honesty carried no glamour, was cast as the villain. His suffering was invisible because honesty that did not flatter the family narrative was unwelcome. The tragedy of Percy is that his honesty aged well, though too late for him to be redeemed in the eyes of many readers. When the ministry collapsed under Voldemort's infiltration, Percy admitted his mistake. In Deathly Hallows, he arrives at the Battle of Hogwarts with tears streaming down his face, apologizing to his family. His words were not clever, they were direct. "I was an idiot, I was a pompous prat, I was wrong, I'm sorry." That honesty, the same unfiltered trait he had always shown, became his redemption. Unlike others who shifted their allegiances with ease, Percy did not hide behind jokes or charm. He stood exposed, and for once, honesty was celebrated. Yet one cannot forget the years when that same trait marked him as outcast. Percy's relationship with Harry complicates this. Harry never mocked Percy the way Fred and George did, but by his very existence, Harry's style of living undermined Percy's values. Harry broke rules for noble causes and Dumbledore quietly endorsed it. Percy enforced rules because he believed in them and was punished with ridicule. Their paths diverged not because Percy hated Harry, but because Harry embodied the opposite of everything Percy believed in. In another world, Percy's honesty could have been recognized as a different kind of courage, the courage to live by convictions even when unpopular. But against Harry's mythic heroism, Percy's steadiness could only look like arrogance. It is telling that in moments of crisis, Percy's qualities were exactly what society needed. His knowledge of bureaucracy, his ability to organize, his relentless attention to detail, all things mocked in school, were vital in resisting the corruption of the ministry once he finally admitted the truth. In the final battle, Percy fought alongside his family, and his grief for Fred was raw, unembellished, utterly honest. He did not disguise his sorrow with jokes or speeches. His honesty in that moment was painful, but real, and it showed that beneath the layers of pomp lay a man who had always lived sincerely. The injustice lies in how readers, too, were invited to laugh at Percy. Rowling often described him with a mocking undertone, his polished shoes, his rigid posture, his obsession with titles. He became the butt of jokes, not the recipient of sympathy. Yet was he not simply a young man trying to find dignity in a large, loud family overshadowed by brighter stars? His honesty about wanting recognition, his refusal to hide ambition, was treated as vanity. But ambition without deceit is not villainy. Percy did not manipulate, did not betray in the sense of treachery. He spoke plainly what others only whispered, that he wanted respect, position, and independence. The question then becomes whether society punishes honesty when it is not charming. Percy's unfiltered devotion to structure lacked the charisma to soften it. Fred could be mischievous and loved for it. Harry could be reckless and hailed as brave. Percy was honest about who he was, and it made him a pariah. When Dumbledore says, in Order of the Phoenix, the truth is a beautiful and terrible thing and should therefore be treated with great caution, one wonders if Percy embodied that truth too literally. He did not dress it in beauty. He simply delivered it, terrible and bare, and the world was not ready for it. In the end, Percy's story is not one of villainy but of misjudgment. His honesty clashed with a world that valued charm, rebellion, and wit. He was punished not for lies, but for sincerity. And while Harry Potter became the symbol of bending rules for the greater good, Percy Weasley became the forgotten emblem of the cost of living without disguise. His honesty was out of fashion, and for that he was unfairly condemned. Yet when the dust settled, his truth remained. He had always been exactly who he said he was. Number 18. He loved his family, but didn't know how to show it. Percy Weasley has always been painted as the black sheep among the Weasley children, but the real tragedy of his story is not arrogance or betrayal. It is misunderstanding. Unlike Fred and George, whose love for their family was loud, mischievous, and impossible to ignore, Percy's affection was subtle, buried beneath rules, advice, and an obsession with structure. The wizarding world tends to favor the flamboyant gestures of loyalty and heroism, but Percy's quiet acts of care never received recognition. He was judged harshly not because he didn't love his family, but because he didn't know how to translate that love into a language they could understand. The Weasley family was filled with big personalities. Fred and George charmed the house with jokes. Ron stumbled through insecurities but always rushed to defend Harry, and Ginny grew fierce and bold in her love for others. Percy stood apart. He was the one who scolded instead of laughed, corrected instead of comforted, and insisted on rules instead of rebellion. To his siblings this seemed like coldness, yet his actions revealed something else. When Percy earned his prefect badge in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, he wore it with immense pride not only for himself, but because he believed it reflected well on his family. He wanted to show that the Weasleys, often dismissed for their poverty, could achieve greatness through discipline and diligence. This was his way of loving them, by trying to elevate their reputation. In truth, Percy's love language was duty. He believed that by following rules, setting a proper example, and advising his siblings on how to succeed, he was protecting them. When Ron received his Hogwarts letter, Percy immediately began offering unsolicited advice about studying and behaving well. His siblings laughed it off, irritated by his pompous tone, but beneath the surface was a brother who desperately wanted Ron to succeed, to avoid mistakes, to have a future free of ridicule. It was clumsy, but it was care. "You better not let things slide this year, Ron," Percy had said with a frown, his prefect's badge gleaming. The words read as nagging, yet they were a shield, his attempt to protect his younger brother from the hardships of failure. The misunderstanding deepened because the Weasleys themselves thrived on warmth, humor, and emotion. Mrs. Weasley fussed over her children's health and knit sweaters as tokens of love. Mr. Weasley indulged their quirks and gave them space to be themselves. The twins pulled Ron into pranks and made him laugh, even through embarrassment. Percy could not compete with this language. He offered structure instead of comfort, correction instead of laughter. His family translated this as arrogance or detachment, but the truth was simpler. Percy lacked the ability to show tenderness in ways they recognized. His love was hidden behind the mask of formality. Harry Potter's arrival into the Weasley circle intensified this divide. Harry was a boy starving for affection, and the Weasleys responded with open warmth. Molly Weasley became a mother figure to him instantly, and Ron's loyalty to Harry was constant. Even Fred and George, often selfish in their jokes, protected Harry fiercely. Compared to this, Percy's cautious and rigid behavior seemed even colder. Harry, with his instinctive need for open displays of affection, could not interpret Percy's advice as love. For Harry, loyalty meant standing by someone's side in a duel, not giving lectures about exam preparation. Thus Percy's way of showing care looked small and irrelevant beside Harry's dramatic battles and Ron's open devotion. Percy's tragedy is clearest in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. The Weasleys rallied around Harry after the Ministry tried to discredit him, but Percy sided with authority. "It's time you realized that you've got to be more careful. Dumbledore is no longer in favor, and standing by him is a dangerous act," he wrote in a letter to Ron. To the Weasleys, this letter was betrayal. To Percy, it was a warning. He believed he was protecting Ron by urging him to stay away from the storm. In his mind, loyalty to his family meant guiding them towards safety and success. even if it meant appearing heartless. But because his family could not read this language, they saw only coldness and disloyalty. The irony is that Percy's desire for everything to be as it should came from a place of insecurity. Growing up poor in a large family, he craved recognition. The prefect badge, the head boy title, the ministry job, these were not only for himself but for the name Weasley. He wanted to prove that they could rise above second-hand robes and jokes about hand-me-down wands. When Cornelius Fudge offered him respect, Percy mistook it for genuine validation. He clung to it not out of selfishness, but because he thought it was the only way to secure honor for his family. In this pursuit, he alienated the very people he wanted to uplift. Consider how different Percy's story is from Ron's. Ron openly defended Harry against Draco Malfoy's insults, even risking physical injury on the chessboard during the hunt for the Philosopher's Stone. These gestures were visible and dramatic, the kind Harry could understand and cherish. Percy, on the other hand, would lecture about studying harder or behaving better, acts that seemed self-serving or pompous. Yet if Percy had been asked, he would have said he was simply trying to help. Both brothers loved fiercely, but one expressed it in action, the other in structure. Only one was recognized as love. Fred and George in particular clashed with Percy. They mocked his seriousness, called him Perfect Percy, and laughed at his ambition. Yet in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when Percy was promoted to work as Mr. Crouch's assistant, he was overjoyed and shared the news proudly. His brothers rolled their eyes, dismissing his success as boring or pompous, but Percy was trying to carry the Weasley name into circles of respect. His family failed to see that this was his form of contribution, his way of fighting for them, just as Fred and George fought through humor and defiance. The difference lay only in visibility, not in sincerity. When the war reached its climax in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Percy's love finally broke through the walls of misunderstanding. He returned to his family during the Battle of Hogwarts, apologizing for his mistakes and fighting alongside them. The moment he laughed with Fred, mocking the ministry, was a reconciliation of languages. For once, Percy expressed love in the way his family understood, through humor, through standing beside them in danger. And yet fate was cruel. Fred died moments later, and Percy was shattered, clinging to his brother's body with desperate grief. This was the raw proof that Percy had always loved them. His coldness had been a mask, but his heart was as vulnerable as any Weasley's. It is important to remember that Percy's missteps were never rooted in lack of love. They were rooted in miscommunication. In psychology, families often struggle when members speak different love languages. Some show love through words, others through gifts, still others through acts of service. Percy's chosen form was duty and correction. The Weasleys' was humor and open affection. Without translation, each side felt rejected by the other. Thus, Percy was condemned as arrogant when in reality he was merely misunderstood. Harry himself unknowingly played a role in deepening the rift. Because Harry valued open loyalty above all, he gravitated toward Ron's devotion and the twins' humor. Percy's warnings felt like obstacles rather than care. Harry, still a boy learning to navigate relationships, could not see the love behind Percy's stern words. As the central figure of the Weasley circle, Harry's perception influenced the family dynamic. If Harry had interpreted Percy differently, perhaps others would have too. Percy's story is a reminder that not all love looks the same. Some love makes you laugh until your stomach hurts. Some love throws itself in front of curses, and some love urges you to study harder, behave better, and reach higher, even if the tone is grating. Percy Weasley loved in the only way he knew how, by trying to set things right. That his family could not see it does not mean it was not there. It only means that his language of love was never translated. The injustice of Percy's reputation lies in this blindness. He became a symbol of pride and betrayal when he was, in fact, a boy longing to be recognized and loved back. His letters, his lectures, his endless advice, these were imperfect but genuine gestures of affection. They were dismissed as arrogance because they did not match the expected warmth. In the end, Percy's love was proven too late, overshadowed by tragedy. But if one looks closely, it was there all along, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. Number 19, he became a victim of circumstances. Percy Weasley is often remembered as the estranged brother, the one who turned his back on the warmth of the burrow and aligned himself with the cold machinery of the Ministry of Magic. Readers tend to judge him harshly, placing him in the shadow of his more likable siblings, Fred and George with their pranks, Ron with his loyalty, Ginny with her courage, and Bill and Charlie with their adventurous independence. Yet if one looks carefully at the time when Percy made his fateful decisions, it becomes clear that he was not simply arrogant or selfish. He was a young man caught in a vortex of history, forced to choose between a hard-earned career and a family united in resistance. His tragedy lies in the fact that every option available to him promised suffering, and his choice marked him as a traitor when, in truth, he was a victim of the circumstances created by forces far larger than himself. Percy's ambition was not born overnight. From his earliest years at Hogwarts, he distinguished himself as a model student, becoming both prefect and, later, head boy. He thrived in an environment where rules and order brought clarity, unlike the chaotic household he grew up in, where gnomes infested the garden and every corner of the burrow seemed alive with mischief. At Hogwarts, Percy discovered a structure that rewarded discipline and diligence, and he excelled in it. This wasn't arrogance at first, but a desperate attempt to prove himself in a family where individuality was often measured by eccentricity or daring. Unlike Bill, who was admired for his cool charm, or Charlie, who gained respect through his adventurous work with dragons, Percy sought validation in the one path that seemed available to him: service to authority. When he earned his position at the Ministry of Magic after Hogwarts, it was the culmination of years of careful effort. The critical moment of fracture came in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, when Dumbledore publicly declared Voldemort's return, and the Ministry, under Cornelius Fudge, denied it. Percy, working as junior assistant to the minister, was placed directly at the heart of this political storm. His family sided with Dumbledore and Harry, but the Ministry called them alarmists. For Percy, the question was not simply one of choosing between right and wrong. It was a choice between maintaining the only path he had ever carved out for himself and abandoning everything he had built. To walk away from the ministry would have meant losing his livelihood, his identity, and the authority he had finally secured. To stay meant turning his back on his parents and siblings. Either path demanded sacrifice. The famous letter Percy sent to Ron is often cited as evidence of his betrayal. In that letter, Percy urged his younger brother to distance himself from Harry, writing, "It is for your own good, Ron. I only want the best for you." Critics remember this as cold-hearted, but it also reveals Percy's genuine fear. He believed that aligning with Harry, a boy painted by the Ministry as delusional and dangerous, would destroy Ron's prospects and bring the family into disrepute. Percy was terrified of watching his younger siblings repeat what he saw as mistakes of recklessness, and in his misguided loyalty to the Ministry, he thought he was protecting them. To condemn him entirely for this action is to ignore the climate of fear and misinformation cultivated by Fudge, who deliberately smeared Dumbledore and Harry to maintain his hold on power. Percy was not the architect of this smear campaign. He was one of its most tragic casualties. It is important to remember that Percy's estrangement occurred at a time when Harry Potter himself was central to the conflict. Harry's defiance of the Ministry, though morally justified, made life impossible for anyone within the Ministry who wanted to survive. For Percy, who worked closely under Fudge, aligning with Harry would have been career suicide. One cannot underestimate how lonely and frightening such a position must have been. Percy had no guarantee that Harry was telling the truth. He had no first-hand experience of Voldemort's resurrection. All he had was the official stance of the government and the insistence of his family. Choosing between those competing realities was not as simple as readers often assume. Percy's situation mirrors that of countless individuals in times of political turmoil. History is filled with examples of people forced to choose between personal advancement and loyalty to kin. What makes Percy stand out is the unforgiving reaction of his family and the readers. Arthur and Molly, though heartbroken, could not accept his choice, and Fred and George openly mocked him, cementing his role as the outcast. Harry himself, whose words carried weight in the Weasley household, did little to defend Percy or try to understand his perspective. Instead, Percy became a symbol of cowardice, a figure to be scorned rather than pitied. Yet, is it fair to place all of this blame on Percy when Harry's central role in escalating the conflict made neutrality impossible? The estrangement becomes more poignant when we consider Percy's age. He was barely out of adolescence when the rift occurred, only a few years older than Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Most young adults of his age are still searching for stability, yet Percy was already thrust into a battle of allegiances that would decide the future of the wizarding world. Expecting him to navigate this perfectly, without error, is unrealistic. That he made the wrong choice in hindsight is undeniable, but at the moment he made it, the choice was not so clear. To him, loyalty to the ministry seemed like loyalty to order, stability, and the safety of society. Even in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Percy's distance from the family remains a painful reminder of how misunderstood he was. The scene where he arrives at the Burrow with the minister for Christmas is often interpreted as a callous attempt to flaunt his career. Yet seen differently, it reveals a man clinging desperately to the only identity left to him. Cut off from his family, Percy tried to prove to himself and others that he had made the right choice. His presence was not an act of cruelty, but of insecurity, a man still seeking validation. Harry, watching the scene, is quick to note the tension, but even he cannot recognize the quiet suffering beneath Percy's stiff demeanor. The turning point comes in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows during the Battle of Hogwarts. Percy finally returns, acknowledging his mistakes and reconciling with his family. His words to Fred, "I was a fool, I was an idiot," are heartfelt, but they also highlight how years of judgment and mockery had reduced his self-worth. His reconciliation is short-lived as Fred dies soon after, and Percy is left devastated. This tragedy underscores how unfairly fate treated him. He had the courage to admit his wrongs, but the opportunity for healing was snatched away almost instantly. His grief at Fred's death, carrying his brother's body, is perhaps one of the most overlooked yet powerful images of the series. Readers often compare Percy unfavorably to Harry, who consistently chose the path of sacrifice, but Harry had something Percy did not: certainty. Harry witnessed Voldemort's return firsthand in the graveyard. He had Dumbledore's trust, Sirius's mentorship, and Hermione and Ron's unwavering loyalty. Percy had none of that. He was surrounded by the ministry's denial, fed propaganda, and isolated from his family when he questioned it. To expect Percy to act with Harry's clarity is to ignore how profoundly different their positions were. Percy was not cowardly, he was misled. What adds weight to this tragedy is the fact that Percy's motives were not selfish in the narrow sense. He truly believed that success at the ministry would allow him to lift his family out of poverty, to give them respectability in a society that often looked down on them for their shabby robes and hand-me-downs. His ambition was not just for himself, but also for them. In a cruel twist, the very ambition meant to honor his family was interpreted as betrayal. Harry, who never had to worry about family pride in the same way, could not understand this pressure. The reader's condemnation of Percy often mirrors the condemnation he faced in the books. Yet, when we revisit the text, it becomes clear that Percy's role was not that of a villain, but of a tragic bystander, swept up in tides he could not control. He is a character who demonstrates how easily good intentions can be twisted into betrayal under the weight of propaganda and fear. The true injustice lies in how little empathy he received, both from his family and from readers, while Harry was consistently seen as the misunderstood hero. Percy's story serves as a reminder that in times of great upheaval, not everyone can be a hero. Some, like Percy, are simply young people caught in impossible situations, making choices that seem logical in the moment but disastrous in hindsight. When judged with compassion, his actions reveal less of a traitor and more of a victim, someone who wanted order and stability but was crushed by the very forces he trusted. Harry's central role in defying the Ministry made Percy's position untenable, and while Harry bore the burden of prophecy, Percy bore the burden of misunderstanding. In the end, Percy Weasley was never evil, never malicious. He was ambitious, flawed, and tragically human. His choices reflected the impossible position he found himself in, a ministry man in a time when the Ministry had become corrupted. If readers are willing to grant Harry the grace of mistakes made under pressure, then Percy too deserves a gentler judgment. His estrangement was less about arrogance and more about the cruelty of circumstance. He was not a villain, only a young man struggling to find a place in a world tearing itself apart. Number 20. His story is a reminder of human complexity. Of all the Weasley siblings, Percy was perhaps the one who stood out for the wrong reasons. He was not the dazzling Quidditch captain like Charlie or Oliver Wood, nor the joker who made everyone laugh like Fred and George. He was not the brave and loyal friend like Ron, nor the dragon handler, nor the ambitious Bill who balanced brilliance with charm. Percy was serious, stiff, and often too proud of his prefect badge and his later role at the Ministry of Magic. Yet what is striking is how his story was shaped by the presence of Harry Potter, whose shadow often amplified Percy's flaws in the eyes of others. Harry's rise to fame and his role as the chosen one placed everyone else in comparison, and for Percy, that comparison was almost always unflattering. From the first moment Harry met the Weasleys, Percy was presented in a particular light. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, when Harry arrived at Platform 9 3/4, Percy was the prefect leading his younger siblings. J.K. Rowling describes him as already talking about his duties as prefect and fussing about the rules. To the young Harry, freshly introduced to the wizarding world, Percy seemed pompous. That impression stayed with readers. Yet Percy's actions were not malicious. He was simply a boy proud of his achievement, eager to step into responsibility. In another family, perhaps he would have been admired for his diligence. In the Weasley household, however, surrounded by louder personalities, Percy looked like the odd one out. Harry's arrival magnified that sense of awkwardness. Ron instantly became Harry's closest friend, Fred and George became his comic relief companions, and even Ginny, years later, became his love. The Weasleys welcomed Harry almost as one of their own, but in this adopted family portrait, Percy became a caricature of arrogance and ambition. Harry rarely bonded with Percy, and this distance made Percy appear colder. Readers, seeing the story through Harry's perspective, absorbed that impression. The truth is that Percy was not cruel to Harry. He simply existed on a different path, one less appealing in a narrative dominated by courage and rebellion. The Ministry of Magic became the place where Percy sought recognition, but this too was shaded by Harry's story. In Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Percy worked hard as assistant to Barty Crouch Sr., taking his duties so seriously that even his siblings mocked him. He was earnest, punctual, and disciplined, qualities that should have earned respect. Instead, Fred and George laughed at him, Ron dismissed him, and even Harry observed Percy's loyalty with a mix of amusement and suspicion. When Crouch began to behave erratically, Percy was blamed as if his own devotion were foolish. His diligence was interpreted as blind obedience, but could Percy have known the truth? He lacked Harry's access to Dumbledore, to prophecies, or to the secret world of Voldemort's return. His mistake was to trust the official structures of authority. Yet isn't that what most people would have done? Harry's position as the boy who constantly challenged authority made Percy's loyalty appear villainous. When Harry insisted in the Order of the Phoenix that Voldemort had returned, Percy sided with the ministry which denied it. This choice tore him from his family. His letter to Ron urging him to distance himself from Harry is one of the most painful moments. "It's for your own good, Ron. The ties of family may be strong, but you must be strong enough to put aside your loyalties to them when it matters." To the reader, who knows Harry is telling the truth, Percy seems cruel. But from Percy's perspective, he was a young man in his early 20s, clinging to the only authority he trusted. He had seen Harry repeatedly break school rules, bend truths, and act against authority. To Percy, Harry was a reckless boy dragging Ron into danger. The tragedy is that Percy's caution was interpreted as betrayal, while Harry's defiance was celebrated as heroism. Even Percy's ambition was filtered through Harry's story. In the eyes of many, he sought personal glory rather than moral truth. But Percy's desire for recognition was not so different from Harry's own hunger for identity beyond the boy who lived. When Harry won the Triwizard Tournament, he was cheered despite the danger it brought. When Percy worked late nights to impress Crouch, he was ridiculed. The double standard was clear. Courage in Harry was noble, ambition in Percy was selfish. And yet Percy's motivations were deeply human. He wanted his family to be proud, to prove that a Weasley could climb the ranks of a powerful institution. His mistake was not ambition itself, but the blindness it created. When Percy finally broke from his family, the judgment against him was harsh. Mrs. Weasley wept, Ron fumed, and even Fred and George used him as the butt of jokes. For readers, too, Percy became a symbol of betrayal. But here lies the deeper truth. His story is a reminder of how quickly we condemn those who make choices different from the ones we admire. Percy was not a Death Eater, nor did he harm anyone directly. He simply chose loyalty to the ministry over loyalty to Harry. In the grand narrative, that was enough to mark him as almost irredeemable. The injustice lies in the fact that his error was one of judgment, not of malice. The irony is that when Harry himself doubted authority, readers applauded him. In The Order of the Phoenix, Harry refused to obey Dolores Umbridge, defying every rule she imposed. Percy, by contrast, obeyed those same rules, believing in the structure of the ministry. Why is rebellion heroic in one and cowardly in the other? The difference is perspective. The story belongs to Harry, and so rebellion becomes courage, while obedience becomes weakness. Yet in real life, most people resemble Percy more than Harry. We follow the rules, trust institutions, and fear stepping into rebellion. Percy is not the villain of the story, he is its uncomfortable mirror. His redemption is quiet but powerful. In the Deathly Hallows, when Percy bursts into the Room of Requirement during the Battle of Hogwarts, apologizing to his family, the moment carries immense weight. He says, "I was a fool, I was an idiot, I was blinded." His words echo what many readers had long felt. But the humility of that confession is greater than any victory on a Quidditch pitch. Percy admits his errors openly at the very moment when others might hide behind excuses. And then, side by side with Fred, he fights against the Death Eaters. In one of the most devastating moments, Fred dies with Percy next to him, and Percy's grief is described with raw humanity. He is screaming and sobbing over his brother's body. The man once mocked for his arrogance is now shown at his most vulnerable, stripped of pride, a brother broken by loss. This tragedy forces us to re-evaluate Percy. He is no longer the pompous prefect, but a man who has suffered and learned. His earlier mistakes now seem small compared to the loyalty he shows at the end. The boy who once chose the ministry over his family spends the last battle at his family's side, proving that redemption is possible. Harry may have been the chosen one, but Percy's journey reminds us that salvation lies not in never making mistakes, but in finding the courage to admit them. Percy's story is also a warning about perspective. Because we see events through Harry's eyes, we often dismiss Percy. Yet Harry himself was not without flaws. He was hot-tempered, reckless, and sometimes cruel in his words, especially in his 5th year. If readers can forgive Harry's lapses, why not Percy's? The difference is that Harry was loved while Percy was not. Harry's mistakes were softened by sympathy. Percy's were hardened by disdain. This reveals a cruel truth. Society is harsher on those it already misunderstands. The way Percy was treated is a reminder of how human nature seeks heroes who shine brightly, ignoring those whose virtues are quieter. We love bravery in the face of danger, but we rarely honor discipline in the face of duty. Percy was mocked for being boring, yet he worked harder than most. He was rejected for siding with authority, yet his decision came from fear and uncertainty, emotions every person knows. His story forces us to confront our own biases. Why do we admire one type of strength while dismissing another? In the end, Percy embodies the complexity of human nature. He was ambitious and proud, but also capable of love and repentance. He was mocked, misunderstood, and unloved, but his path led him to the same side as his family in the final hour. Harry Potter's story may have cast him as the foil, the one who chose wrongly, but perhaps that is the very reason his story matters. It shows that not all heroes stand in the spotlight. Some stumble, fall, and return quietly. And in that return lies a kind of courage every bit as important as Harry's defiance. Percy's life reminds us that the unloved deserve compassion. He was not the golden boy, not the chosen one, not the joker or the rebel. He was the brother who was mocked and sometimes despised, yet he found his way back to love. His arc challenges us to see beyond the easy labels of hero and villain, loyalty and betrayal. For in Percy's quiet struggle lies a truth about humanity itself, that even those who are misunderstood can still choose the light, and that every flawed soul carries the potential for redemption. Number 21. He always strived for independence. Percy Weasley's place in the Harry Potter story has always been overshadowed by the brilliance, chaos, and magnetism of those around him. From the very first time we see him in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Percy is introduced not as a character of his own, but as the prefect, the one enforcing rules on the train, reminding his younger siblings to behave. He becomes almost a caricature of responsibility, someone that the other Weasleys, or Pink and eventually the readers, treat with a mixture of irritation and dismissal. Yet behind the rigid posture and the clipped tone was someone struggling with something far deeper, the burden of carving out his own identity in a family already brimming with larger-than-life personalities. In this struggle, Percy became unfairly maligned, and Harry Potter's arrival only made it worse. It is no secret that the Weasley family adored Harry almost instantly. Molly Weasley embraced him like another son. Ron formed a friendship that changed both their lives. Fred and George found endless amusement in teasing him while also respecting his bravery. Even Ginny, though initially shy, developed an adoration that defined much of her youth. For Percy, however, Harry's presence meant competition of the most impossible kind. Percy had spent years clawing his way toward recognition, hoping that achievements and hard work would distinguish him from his brothers. Suddenly Harry became the center of attention, not just in the wizarding world, but within the Weasley household itself. It created an invisible wall between Percy's attempts at independence and the family's new fascination with their adopted hero. Unlike Fred and George, who dazzled everyone with humor, or Charlie, who earned admiration for his dragon work, Percy's path was never destined to inspire awe. He lacked Bill's charm, Ron's proximity to Harry's fame, or Ginny's later reputation for bravery. Percy had only diligence, his obsession with rules, and a relentless desire to climb the ranks. He wasn't glamorous, but he was determined. This single-mindedness was often mistaken for arrogance, yet in truth it was survival. In a family where the twins could turn every failure into laughter and Ron could hide in Harry's glow, Percy had no shield. He only had the ability to work harder than anyone else. That ambition, so often misread, was not about crushing others beneath him, but about proving to himself that he was not invisible. A pivotal moment that reveals the unfair treatment of Percy comes in the Goblet of Fire. When Percy is promoted to acting as personal assistant to Bartemius Crouch Sr., he is elated. Weatherby, as Crouch mistakenly calls him, becomes a cruel joke within his family. Fred and George seize upon it immediately, mocking him for his eagerness to serve. Yet beneath the laughter is something darker, the dismissal of his achievements. For Percy, who had worked tirelessly at the ministry, being entrusted with such responsibility meant everything. He was building a life independent of his family's chaotic reputation, and finally, he was being recognized. But instead of support, he was met with ridicule. Even Ron joined the chorus of derision, laughing at his brother's expense. Here, Harry's influence was subtle but undeniable. Because Harry never respected authority figures who valued order above loyalty, Percy's attempts at discipline were framed as comic relief rather than admirable effort. One must remember that Percy's dream was not one of grandeur. He was not aiming for fame like Gilderoy Lockhart, nor was he obsessed with power like Cornelius Fudge. His ambition was quiet, bureaucratic, and deeply personal. In Chamber of Secrets, when he is caught snogging Penelope Clearwater, it is one of the rare times we see him outside of his rigid shell. Even then, the revelation becomes another punchline for Fred and George. The boy who desperately wanted to be taken seriously became instead the butt of jokes, even in matters of love. Compared to Harry, who could stumble through chaos and still emerge celebrated, Percy's carefully built reputation crumbled at the smallest hint of vulnerability. The tragedy of Percy's story is that his choices were read in the harshest possible light, while Harry's were forgiven again and again. When Percy sided with the ministry during Order of the Phoenix, readers and family alike branded him as a traitor. He was condemned for turning his back on his family. But consider the circumstances. Percy had spent his entire life fighting to be acknowledged on his own terms. When the ministry, the institution he had sacrificed everything to serve, offered him validation, he could not refuse. Was it misguided? Yes, but was it truly betrayal? Or was it the desperate grasp of a man who finally saw a way to step out of the suffocating shadow of both his family and Harry Potter? Harry could defy authority, speak back to professors, even break rules, and be hailed as courageous. Percy could not afford that luxury. For him, rules were the ladder. Loyalty to the ministry was the only route to independence. The unfairness is amplified when we look at how Dumbledore treated Percy compared to Harry. Dumbledore could overlook Harry's transgressions, smiling knowingly when the boy broke curfews or challenged professors. Percy, however, never inspired that same indulgence. His attempts to enforce rules or uphold order were dismissed as pedantry. Even within Gryffindor, Percy was a misfit. Gryffindors thrived on daring, bold gestures, acts of rebellion that caught attention. Percy's courage was different. It was the courage to follow an unglamorous path, to accept ridicule while maintaining discipline. That bravery, quieter but no less real, went uncelebrated. When Fred died in the Battle of Hogwarts, Percy's grief was overwhelming. Fred's body lay in a niche, and Percy was shaking uncontrollably. In that moment, we see the mask of formality torn away. This was not the cold bureaucrat the family accused him of being, but a brother shattered by loss, someone who had loved fiercely even while misunderstood. His reconciliation with the Weasleys came too late, and the reader is left with the bitter truth that Percy had been punished for the crime of being different. Harry, who had become the symbol of defiance and unity, was forgiven for countless mistakes. Percy, who simply wanted to matter, bore the weight of condemnation. The irony of Percy's arc is that his ambition mirrored aspects of Harry himself. Harry often felt crushed by expectations and longed to define himself beyond the title of the boy who lived. He bristled at being seen as only a symbol. Percy's struggle was parallel but inverted. He feared being seen as nothing at all. Yet instead of empathy, Harry regarded Percy with skepticism. In Order of the Phoenix, when Percy writes to Ron urging him to cut ties with Harry for his own future, it is framed as callous manipulation. But imagine Percy's mindset. He saw his younger brother at a crossroads and, believing the Ministry's version of events, thought he was offering protection. Percy was wrong, but his intention was not cruelty. It was the misguided care of someone who believed loyalty to the institution would safeguard the family. Even when Percy returned to the fold, it was overshadowed by the grandeur of Harry's role in the battle. Percy's duel with the Death Eater Pious Thickness, his sudden humour when he joked that he had resigned from the Ministry, was drowned in the chaos of war. Harry's heroism was destined to be remembered, while Percy's redemption was relegated to a footnote. Once again, his story dissolved into the margins, his independence dismissed even as he stood beside his family in their darkest hour. Percy Weasley, in the end, is a study in how narratives are shaped by perception. Harry's defiance of rules was romanticized, Percy's respect for them was vilified. Harry's mistakes were excused by destiny, Percy's by ambition were painted as betrayal. Yet the truth is that Percy embodied a different kind of resilience, one that did not rely on prophecy or charisma. His strength was the willingness to endure mockery, to commit to an unpopular path, to carve an identity in a world that preferred heroes over clerks. He may not have been beloved, but he was undeniably brave. The most striking example of this double standard lies in how the family rewarded different behaviors. Ron could sulk about hand-me-down robes and feel validated by his role in Harry's adventures. Fred and George could mock teachers and become legends. Ginny could defy expectations and rise to heroism. Percy, however, was condemned for wanting a career. It is as though the family could only recognize worth when it mirrored Harry's values. Anyone outside that mold became a target of suspicion. Thus, Percy was never allowed to be seen as independent. He was always framed as either pompous or disloyal. Even after the war, one imagines that Percy's contributions remained forgotten. Harry went on to become an Auror, Ron joined him, and Ginny rose to fame as a professional Quidditch player. Percy likely returned to his ministry work, unnoticed, the same way he had lived most of his life. And yet, his perseverance speaks volumes. In a world where the spotlight favored the extraordinary, Percy chose to live in the ordinary and still fight for recognition. That choice, though ridiculed, deserves admiration. For Percy Weasley was not the villain the narrative made him seem. He was simply a man who wanted, above all, to stand on his own. Number 22, his loneliness went unnoticed. Of all the Weasley children, Percy was perhaps the one whose loneliness lingered in the shadows, unnoticed even by those closest to him. He stood out not for wild mischief like Fred and George, nor for athleticism like Charlie, nor for the quiet strength of Bill. He did not carry Ron's insecurities or Ginny's fiery courage. Instead, Percy was the one who buried himself in books, chased rules with almost religious devotion, and wore responsibility as a shield. Yet beneath his polished prefect badge and his tidy owl scores was a boy aching to belong. That aching often went unseen, overshadowed by the brilliance of his siblings and, later, by the meteoric presence of Harry Potter himself. Percy's story was not one of betrayal, as some fans have reduced it, but of a gradual alienation built through years of being the odd one out in a noisy, affectionate family. In Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, when Ron receives his new broomstick from Sirius and Fred and George cackle about their pranks, Percy is described simply as the only one who had any sense. It is a passing line, almost comedic, but what it reveals is startling. His role in the family was often reduced to the killjoy, the butt of a joke. the humorless brother, no one took seriously. Every family needs its clown, its dreamer, its rebel. But what happens when someone becomes cast as the permanent scold, with little warmth returned for their efforts? It is easy to forget that Percy was only 2 years older than Fred and George, and yet the distance between them felt like decades. While the twins built their bond on mischief and constant laughter, Percy became the perfect counterpoint, someone to mock, someone to roll eyes at, someone to use as the foil in their jokes. The text makes this dynamic plain. "Shut up, Percy, you're not the boss of us." That refrain followed him everywhere. It wasn't merely playful sibling teasing. It was a pattern that carved his place in the family as the perpetual outsider. Instead of laughter binding them, it isolated him further. When Harry Potter entered the Weasley household, Percy's invisibility only deepened. Harry was an orphan, a boy who carried tragedy in his very name, and naturally the Weasleys poured their affection on him. Molly became almost maternal. Arthur treated him like another son, and Ron found in him a companion who understood insecurity and dreams of being seen. But Percy? He was not the chosen friend, not the one to offer Harry insight into Hogwarts, not the confidant. Even when Percy tried to be responsible and guide others with rules, his words fell on deaf ears. The presence of Harry made the differences between Percy and his brothers even sharper, because Harry filled the gap of emotional closeness Percy himself had been denied. One of the clearest moments of Percy's alienation comes in Goblet of Fire. While the others celebrate Harry's surprising entry into the Triwizard Tournament, Percy is portrayed as absorbed in his job at the Ministry. He praises Mr. Crouch, he talks endlessly about regulations, and his excitement lies not in Quidditch or mischief, but in bureaucratic achievement. Many readers laugh at him as though his ambition were nothing more than parody. But what if this devotion to rules was simply a mask, a way to cope with the aching truth that his own family rarely saw him for who he was? Percy was in a particularly good mood, having just been promoted to Mr. Crouch's personal assistant, the book states. It reads as arrogance, yet it is the pride of someone desperate to be recognized at last. The cruelty of his siblings was often brushed aside as comedy, but imagine being Percy in those moments. When Fred and George turned his head boy badge into one that read, "Big Head Boy," everyone laughed, including his parents. What was presented as harmless fun was, in truth, humiliating. Percy was mocked for the very thing that gave him purpose, for the hard work that had won him the position. For once in his life he had something to be proud of, and yet his achievement was reduced to a joke. The message was clear: no matter how hard you try, your seriousness will always be ridiculous. How long can a young man bear such dismissal before he begins to distance himself in return? Harry's presence intensified this dismissal. For Ron, Harry was the golden ticket out of his brother's shadows. For Fred and George, Harry was another audience to entertain. For Ginny, Harry was the dream come true. But for Percy, Harry was the silent rival who ensured that Percy's achievements would never shine in the same light. Even Percy's hard work at the Ministry could not compare to Harry's destiny. How could a job promotion compete with the boy who had survived Voldemort? Each time Harry returned to the burrow, Percy faded further into the background, remembered only when he was nagging or fussing. What many forget is that Percy did show care for Harry in subtle ways. In Chamber of Secrets, when Ginny is taken into the chamber, Percy is visibly distraught. Yet his grief is mocked by Fred and George, who suggest he is more worried about his secret girlfriend Penelope Clearwater. Percy, for once, has a moment of vulnerability. Yet even then his emotions are laughed at. The loneliness here is profound. He cannot even express worry for his sister without being the punchline. And Harry, understandably overwhelmed with his own burdens, cannot notice the deeper wound in Percy's heart. By the time Percy aligns himself with the Ministry against his family, readers judge him harshly. But step back and the reasons become painfully clear. He was, for once, offered validation, status, and the recognition he craved all his life. The ministry told him he mattered, that his work was essential, that his seriousness was not foolish but necessary. His own family, meanwhile, laughed at his badges, his ambition, his formality. Faced with two competing homes, Percy chose the one that respected him, even if it was tragically the wrong choice. His betrayal was not born of malice but of years of neglect. Consider how Molly doted on Harry during the Triwizard Tournament, sending him food and knitted sweaters. Percy, meanwhile, was left to wrestle with a crumbling ministry job and the looming threat of Voldemort alone. In Order of the Phoenix, Percy severs ties with his family, and while this act seems cruel, one must ask why he felt it was his only option. He writes a letter to Ron, urging him to distance himself from Harry, not out of pure loyalty to the ministry, but out of genuine fear that Ron will end up destroyed by Harry's dangerous path. This letter, often read as arrogance, can also be seen as a desperate attempt by Percy to protect his younger brother in the only language he knew: rules and caution. Harry, ironically, became both the anchor of the Weasley family and the wedge that drove Percy further out. Every time Harry was celebrated, Percy's absence became less noticeable. Every triumph of Harry's reinforced Percy's irrelevance. And while Ron could find solace in being Harry's best friend, Percy had no such role. He could not compete for affection, and he could not join in the laughter that came so naturally to his brothers. His isolation grew chapter by chapter until it was easier for him to embrace cold bureaucracy than risk another round of humiliation at the Burrow's dinner table. Even at the climax, Percy's loneliness is evident. In Deathly Hallows, when he finally returns to his family during the Battle of Hogwarts, it is not with fanfare or speeches. He simply appears, apologizes, and fights beside them. His reunion is almost quiet compared to the intensity of the battle, as though Percy himself knows that too many years of absence cannot be mended by words alone. And yet this moment proves the truth. Despite everything, despite his choices, Percy always longed to belong. His return was not the act of a traitor, but of a son who, even after rejection, still craved the warmth of his family's acceptance. When Fred dies, it is Percy who is described as clutching his brother's body, sobbing without restraint. This detail is vital. It is not Harry who holds Fred, nor Ron, nor George. It is Percy, the brother mocked and ridiculed, the one accused of betrayal, the one left out of laughter. In that moment, all of Percy's loneliness pours out, unfiltered, raw, devastating. His grief reveals how deeply he loved his family, even if they had failed to see his pain for so long. In the end, Percy's story is not about arrogance or betrayal, but about how easy it is to overlook the quiet kind of loneliness. Harry Potter, without meaning to, became the gravitational force around which the Weasleys revolved. He was the guest of honor, the symbol of hope, the friend who filled gaps. And yet, in giving Harry that place, the family missed the chance to truly see Percy. They laughed when he longed to be praised, they dismissed him when he tried to lead, and they underestimated how deeply isolation can cut. Percy's tragedy is that his solitude was never recognized until it was too late, until loss forced the family to see him not as the joke, not as the bureaucrat, but as the grieving brother who had been aching for love all along. Number 23, his loyalty to duty was mistaken for pride. Of all the Weasleys, Percy was perhaps the most misunderstood, and the presence of Harry Potter in the family's story magnified that misunderstanding. Percy's defining trait was his loyalty to structure, order, and the path he believed was right. To him, rules and institutions represented stability in a world that so often leaned toward chaos, but in the eyes of those around him, especially when Harry was hailed as the chosen one and breaker of rules, Percy's loyalty to rules was twisted into arrogance. His methodical pursuit of success and respect was too easily painted as vanity. Harry's natural charisma, his tendency to follow instinct rather than structure, cast Percy's choices in the harsh light of comparison. What was loyalty to principle in Percy seemed like stubbornness, while Harry's rebellion looked like courage. In Hogwarts, Percy's dedication was evident from the earliest days. He became a prefect and later head boy, honours that required commitment and discipline. These roles demanded more than ambition. They required a willingness to carry responsibility, even when it meant unpopularity. In Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, Percy was often seen patrolling corridors and reprimanding younger students, and though others mocked his seriousness, it was that same seriousness that kept order when the castle was under threat. Yet in contrast to Harry, who broke rules to uncover truth and was applauded for it, Percy was remembered more for his strictness than for his steadfast defense of order. When Harry sneaked into forbidden corridors, he was brave. When Percy enforced rules, he was pompous. This disparity planted the seeds of unfair judgment. The real turning point came during the rise of Voldemort's Second War. Percy's decision to side with the Ministry of Magic was branded as betrayal of his family. But what most forget is that Percy had always believed in the authority of institutions, and his loyalty to the Ministry was not an act of selfish ambition, but rather of conviction. In Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the Ministry insisted Voldemort had not returned. Percy accepted this view because he believed the Ministry was the cornerstone of wizarding society. In his mind, trusting it was the same as trusting stability itself. To abandon it would have meant embracing chaos and uncertainty, something Percy could not do. His belief was not a lack of love for his family, but a devotion to what he thought would preserve the wizarding world. Harry's presence, however, made Percy's choices look darker than they were. Harry, standing as the symbol of resistance and truth, made the Ministry appear corrupt and blind. In aligning with the Ministry, Percy was set against Harry in the public's imagination, which meant he was cast as a villain even in his own family. When Ron, Fred, and George mocked him for writing letters full of formality and ambition, readers were invited to laugh along, forgetting that Percy's way of communicating was shaped by his desire to be taken seriously in a world that often dismissed him. His Dear Mr. Potter letter to Harry in Order of the Phoenix was seen as a pompous attack, but it was also the letter of a man clinging to what he thought was reason in the face of hysteria. The tragedy lies in how Percy's motives were reinterpreted. His loyalty was mistaken for pride, his caution for cowardice, his ambition for greed. When Fred and George opened Weasley's Wizard Wheezes, their disregard for rules and love for chaos was celebrated, even by Molly. Percy's love of order and discipline, on the other hand, was treated as pretentiousness. In reality, both were expressions of strength. Fred and George showed strength in innovation, Percy in loyalty to structure. Yet Harry, through no fault of his own, tilted the balance. Because Harry was a natural rule-breaker and rebel, his influence made Percy's devotion to order look like arrogance. Where Harry's defiance was justified, Percy's obedience looked small-minded. One can see the irony most clearly at the Battle of Hogwarts. When Percy finally reunited with his family and fought against the Death Eaters, he revealed the depth of his courage. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, he declared, "I was a fool, I was an idiot, I was a pompous prat." But this was not the voice of arrogance. It was the voice of someone who recognized how his principles had separated him from his family. Even then, his actions proved that his loyalty had always been to the greater good of order and safety. Percy fought bravely alongside his brothers, and when Fred was killed, he remained by his side in grief, showing that his devotion to family had never disappeared. The tragedy is that it took a war for his family to see that his so-called pride was rooted in strength, not vanity. Percy's story also highlights the cruelty of comparison. Ron was always measured against Harry, but Ron had the benefit of being Harry's closest friend, sharing in his adventures. Percy, however, stood apart. He was compared not in companionship, but in contrast. Harry's rebellion was valorized, Percy's obedience condemned. Readers and characters alike assumed Percy cared only for titles, prefect, head boy, ministry official, without acknowledging the sacrifice behind those titles. Every step Percy took required the endurance of mockery and misunderstanding. He chose responsibility over popularity, yet was punished for it. Harry's fame created a lens through which Percy could only appear as prideful, when in truth he was simply committed to what he believed in. The very language used to describe Percy reveals the bias. Words like pompous, self-important, and prig appear in the narrative, often filtered through Ron or the twins' perspective. Rarely do we hear Percy's own thoughts, except when he admits his mistakes in the final book. By contrast, Harry's perspective dominates the series, and Harry's rebellious acts are framed as necessary and brave. When Harry broke into Umbridge's office, readers cheered. When Percy followed ministry orders, readers scoffed. Both were acts of loyalty, Harry to truth, Percy to order, but one was painted as heroism and the other as arrogance. The unfairness lies in the framing, not in Percy's character. Consider also Percy's relationship with his parents. Molly and Arthur loved him, but they did not always understand him. Molly adored Harry as if he were her seventh son, and Harry's humility won her heart. Percy's ambition, however, created friction. When Percy sought recognition within the ministry, Molly viewed it as vanity. Yet the truth was more complex. Percy, raised in a family of modest means, longed to prove that hard work could elevate him. His pride was not in himself, but in what diligence could achieve. In a household where mischief was celebrated, his seriousness seemed alien. When Harry arrived, embodying both bravery and humility, Percy's image suffered even more by comparison. It was easier to see Percy as prideful than to recognize the quiet strength of his perseverance. The way Percy's story unfolded also reflects a deeper theme. Society often mocks those who follow the rules while glorifying those who break them. Percy's tragedy was to live in a time when rules were corrupted, when the ministry itself became blind. His faith in structure was misplaced, but the core quality, his refusal to abandon what he thought was right, was not weakness. In many ways, Percy's story mirrors the classic archetype of the loyal knight who serves the wrong king. His failure was not moral, but circumstantial, and when he realized his error, he had the courage to return, apologize, and fight alongside those he had hurt. It is also worth noting that Percy's ambition, often mocked, brought him to positions of influence where he could make a difference. At the ministry, he had access to information and authority that could one day be used for good. His downfall was trusting too much in the system, not in being self-serving. Unlike characters such as Cornelius Fudge, who clung to power for its own sake, Percy's dedication was never about controlling others, but about finding a place of responsibility where he could ensure order. His flaw was not arrogance, but faith misplaced in the wrong leaders. When we recall Percy's arc, it becomes clear that his reputation suffered because he was cast as a foil to Harry. Where Harry represented instinct, rebellion, and personal courage, Percy embodied discipline, order, and institutional loyalty. The two qualities are not opposites, but complements, yet readers were encouraged to view them as rivals. The injustice is that Percy's virtues were overshadowed by Harry's heroism. His refusal to give up even when mocked should have been seen as admirable. Instead, it was taken as proof of arrogance. The lens of comparison turned his loyalty into a flaw. By the end of the series, Percy's redemption came too late to erase the years of misunderstanding. Fred's death froze him forever in the role of the brother who returned at the cost of tragedy. Yet perhaps his greatest strength was revealed in that moment. He stayed, grieving openly, fighting on despite his pain. That was not the act of a proud man, but of a loyal one. Percy's story, if seen clearly, is one of perseverance misunderstood as pride, of loyalty disguised as vanity. And much of that misunderstanding came because Harry Potter's presence made rebellion shine brighter than discipline, leaving Percy's quiet strength overlooked. Number 24. His sacrifice remained unseen. Of all the Weasley children, Percy Ignatius Weasley remains the most misunderstood. When readers first encounter him, he is described as pompous, self-important, and consumed by ambition. He polishes his prefect badge and later struts through Hogwarts as head boy, speaking in a clipped, officious tone. To Harry, Ron, and even to readers, Percy often appears as comic relief, a figure to be laughed at rather than admired. Yet behind the spectacles and the stiff posture was a young man making sacrifices that few recognized, and Harry Potter's presence, though unintentional, magnified the harshness with which Percy was treated. Harry, the chosen boy who united the Weasley family in warmth, also became the standard against which Percy's loyalty was judged. In that comparison, Percy's struggles appeared cold, his distance unforgivable, and his sacrifices invisible. The defining fracture in Percy's life came when he sided with the Ministry of Magic against his family during Voldemort's return. "He's such a stupid idiot," Ron explodes in Order of the Phoenix, condemning Percy's belief that Harry is delusional and that Dumbledore is reckless. The reader is expected to take Ron's side. After all, Harry has faced Voldemort firsthand, and the Weasleys have always been Harry's staunch defenders. Yet what is rarely considered is the immense cost Percy bore for this choice. He did not leave the burrow with triumph. He left in shame, burdened with the belief that if he succeeded within the ministry, his family's name, often associated with poverty and eccentricity, might finally be elevated. He was trying to prove something not for himself alone, but for the Weasleys as a whole. Percy's so-called betrayal cannot be separated from the shadow Harry cast across the wizarding world. Harry was not just Ron's best friend. He was a boy who inspired Arthur and Molly's protective instincts, who was welcomed to the burrow as though he had always been one of their own. For Percy, who had always fought for recognition among his siblings, Harry's arrival cemented the hierarchy. The family's attention shifted naturally toward Harry, who brought danger, excitement, and fame into their household. When Harry stayed for the summer, it was his stories that captivated everyone, his safety that mattered most. Percy's triumphs, his OWL, his prefect. Status, his work in the ministry seemed dull in comparison. In that environment, Percy's hunger for acknowledgement only intensified, and his decision to pursue a separate path became both rebellion and sacrifice. Consider the way Percy maintained his composure after leaving the burrow. While Molly wept over the loss of her son's presence, and Arthur shook his head in disappointment, Percy stood alone in a small flat in London. He sent back his Christmas jumper, a gesture that broke Molly's heart, but which was not done from cruelty. It was an act of stubborn consistency, of convincing himself that he was strong enough to sever ties, even when every night must have been heavy with loneliness. His younger siblings still had the burrow's warmth. Percy had silence. This was not the arrogance of an upstart, but the silent endurance of someone who convinced himself that estrangement was the price of progress. He refused to allow his longing for home to undo the image of authority he had built. The injustice lies in how the narrative framed him. Percy is seen primarily through Harry and Ron's eyes, and so his faults are magnified. Readers laugh when he drones on about cauldron thickness in Goblet of Fire, or when he fusses over formality at school. What they do not see is the discipline beneath these habits. Percy did not have Fred and George's charm or Bill's natural magnetism, nor Charlie's rugged independence. His strength was diligence, an unglamorous but necessary quality. He believed that by excelling in structure and order, he could shield his family from ridicule and prove that a Weasley could rise above mockery. To Harry, who embodied defiance and instinct, Percy's choices seemed cowardly. Yet Percy's brand of bravery, walking alone into a life of rules and restraint, was no less difficult. Even at the ministry, Percy was not blind. Though he parroted Cornelius Fudge's skepticism about Harry, it was less about believing Harry a liar than about clinging desperately to the only institution that seemed stable. When the world threatened chaos, Percy doubled down on rules. This is the mindset of a young man terrified of losing everything: his family, his career, his identity. So he chose the one anchor he could hold: bureaucracy. His letters to Ron in Order of the Phoenix are stiff, full of warnings about loyalty and ambition, but underneath is the voice of someone begging his brother to avoid the same mistakes he believed their parents were making. The tragedy is that no one read the desperation beneath his words. They only saw condescension. Percy's estrangement cannot be separated from the subtle pressure Harry's narrative placed upon the Weasleys. To stand with Harry was to be righteous, courageous, and loyal. To question Harry, even indirectly, was to betray. The family saw Harry as a son, and Percy's skepticism became unforgivable not only because it clashed with truth, but because it hurt Harry. Thus, Percy was cast as selfish, when in reality he bore a burden others never had to shoulder. He sacrificed the love of his family in order to pursue a vision of stability for them. That his sacrifice was misguided does not make it any less painful. When war reached its peak, Percy's return was marked by one of the series' most emotional moments. He appeared at Hogwarts, seeking reconciliation, declaring with tears that he had been an idiot. I was a fool. This was not a sudden change of heart, but the breaking of years of hardened defences. He admitted what readers had long assumed, that beneath the proud exterior he had always longed for home. His return coincided with his brother Fred's death, an unspeakable cruelty. The reconciliation Percy had sought came wrapped in grief, as though the narrative demanded one last punishment for his years of separation. In that moment, Percy's suffering is laid bare, and the injustice of his earlier portrayal becomes undeniable.